Beneath the city of Derby in the UK, there is an extensive array of catacombs. It's possible to access them via the back room of an old pub called the Tiger. Derby has a cathedral, and the cathedral also has many tunnels and crypts below it. Whether they connect up with the ones that you can access via the back room of the Tiger, I'm not sure, but that's what inspired today's story. In 2022, the vicar of the parish of St Anthony's in East Temming, in the north of England, passed away after a short illness. Among his personal effects was discovered a truly terrifying account of his traverse of a tunnel of medieval origin that had long been rumoured to lie below St Anthony's Church, known locally and informally as Temming Cathedral. The vicar, a certain Reverend Giles Asquith, was not known to be given to flights of fancy, yet the events he recorded are so disturbing that they can hardly be taken at face value. I will now reproduce the account in full, and at the end I should like to make a few remarks about recent developments in the still ongoing investigation of the matter. July 2001. From 1961 to 1966, I was a young and rather naive curate at St Anthony's, where I have since served as vicar. Our congregation these days has dwindled rather, along with others, but I am proud to have served the wonderful parish of St Anthony's for some 40 years. St Anthony's Church itself is of considerable historical importance, in addition to its religious importance and the meaning it has to each of us on a personal level. The church was built in 1842 and, as is often remarked, more resembles a cathedral than a typical parish church. It was designed by the great architect Augustus Pugin, and its construction was generously funded by the wealthy Armitage family. In spite of the joy I have found by the grace of God in serving the parish, there is in my past an episode which sits heavily upon my conscience. I refrained at first from bringing it to light because I was afraid that it might taint the reputation of St Anthony's. Perhaps I was also afraid of being blamed for the incident. Later, I kept the secret primarily because I feared I would not be believed. I feel it now behoves me to document what happened one dark evening in 1962. I do not intend to make this account public in my lifetime, but it will be found after my death, and perhaps someone wiser than myself can decide what best to do with it. It is not widely known to the public that our church acts as a repository for several extremely old Bibles. In particular, we have 2 original copies of the Coverdale Bible, both dating to the late 16th century and in marvellous condition. To those of us charged with caring for these wonderful texts, they represent the continuing light of God's love, which has illuminated our grey and cloudy island for perhaps 17 centuries. Unfortunately, the great monetary value of these Bibles also represents a quick profit to thieves, which is why we prefer to keep their existence something of a secret. The Bibles are kept in a crypt which can only be accessed by displacing a heavy stone slab. This slab was put in place in 1907 and can be raised only by an elaborate pulley mechanism, which is accessed via a secret handle that I shall not document here. It was noted in 1912 by one of my predecessors, the Reverend Thomas Selston, that if the handle is not correctly wound to its fullest extent, the stone slab may be provoked into lowering itself by the slightest disturbance. Accordingly, a bell was placed in one of the alcoves that adorn the church walls to be operated by a string that leads down into the crypt. The Reverend Selston himself spent an unexpected 52 hours in the crypt due to this idiosyncrasy of the mechanism, and it was his fervent and thoughtful wish that the experience not be repeated by himself or others. Therefore, anyone becoming trapped in the crypt may signal their presence to those above by ringing the bell. I do not know how the particular thieves with whom we have to deal here found out about the Bibles in the crypt. I fear I may have been insufficiently guarded after sharing an incautious sherry with a certain parishioner in the course of my pastoral duties. I happened to be alone in the church on a Saturday evening preparing for the following day's mass when they entered the building. There were two of them, and they had taken the trouble to conceal their identities via the use of balaclavas. At the time I had no idea who they were. I remember the balaclavas were somewhat damp due to the drizzle outside. One of the men was rather slim and tall, but strongly built, and the other shorter and of somewhat more rotund dimensions. I have since come to believe that these men were none other than a Mr. Davis of Withen Close and a Mr. Cranthorpe of Station Road, Mr. Davis being the stouter of the two men. I shall accordingly refer to them in this account as Davis and Cranthorpe. Upon sighting me, Cranthorpe produced a sawn-off shotgun from under his raincoat, and Davis a large knife of the machete type. I will attempt to reproduce the ensuing dialogue, although since I am now casting my mind back over the space of some 39 years, I cannot guarantee the absolute accuracy of every detail of the conversation. I have omitted some unnecessary swearing and blasphemies that issued from the mouths of the two men. Cranthorpe got straight to the point. "Where's the crypt?" he said. "Which crypt?" I replied. "St. Anthony's has several." "The one with the Bibles in it," he said. "Most of our crypts have Bibles in them," I said. "This is after all a church." At this, Davis stepped forwards and I was afraid that he was going to slash me open with the machete, but instead he punched me in the solar plexus. "You know what we want," said Cranthorpe. "The antique Bibles, the valuable ones. Show us where the crypt is or we'll cut you into 6 different pieces." I was temporarily unable to reply due to being winded, but I hobbled over to the secret location of the pulley that opens the crypt. When I was able to draw breath again, I said to him, "This winding mechanism opens the crypt, but I beg of you to reconsider. The Bibles of which you speak are extremely rare and therefore highly traceable. I doubt you will get away with this proposed crime. Our Lord himself was placed on the cross next to 2 thieves, yet when one thief repented, open it and shut your gob," said Cranthorpe rudely. I was under strict instructions from the Reverend Donald Jackson not to sacrifice my life for those precious books in the event that such a theft should ever occur, so I began to laboriously wind the mechanism. The stone slab began to slowly open, revealing the crypt beneath. "Hurry it up," said Cranthorpe when he saw how long the process was taking. Davis, who at that point still hadn't said a word, placed a machete menacingly at my chest. "It takes 284 windings to fully open it," I replied. "There's nothing I can do to speed it up." "Wind faster," said Cranthorpe. When the slab was half open, Cranthorpe said, "That's enough," and he scuttled under the raised slab and onto the stone steps beneath. Davis pushed me forwards, indicating that I should follow Cranthorpe. As I have mentioned, the stone slab was prone to closing itself when given even one less winding than the full amount, never mind when stopped halfway. I almost thought to mention this to the thieves, but I decided against it in case any unnecessary speech should provoke the men to further violence. "Show us the Bibles," said Cranthorpe. At this point I conceived of a marvellous ruse. It seemed to me unlikely that these men were biblical scholars, and it happened that the Coverdales resided in a cupboard that was somewhat concealed from normal view. We had a small stock of less valuable Bibles, antique Derby Bibles, and a couple of original printings of Bagster's Comprehensive, and so on, in a far more visible cupboard. It was to this latter cupboard that I directed the men. They began stuffing the Bibles into a sports bag, rather carelessly I thought, feeling relieved that the Coverdales had not been subject to such treatment. It was while filling the sports bag that the men noticed that the stone slab was gradually closing. Davis ran up the stairs and tried to stop it, not daring to attempt to squeeze through the remaining gap and risk getting crushed, but he was unable to support the weight of the immense slab. Cranthorpe ran to help him, but even with his assistance, the slab inexorably closed. The crypt even then had its own electrical lights, so we were not plunged into darkness, but certainly we were sealed irrevocably inside the crypt. Only a person on the outside familiar with the mechanism, or professionals with hydraulic equipment would have been able to open the crypt. "Open it!" shouted Cranthorpe. "I can't," I said. "It doesn't open from the inside." "There is, however, a bell which we can ring to attract attention. The Reverend will arrive early tomorrow morning and will hear us if we ring it." "Wouldn't that be convenient for you?" said Cranthorpe. "He'll call the police for you as well, I shouldn't wonder." Davis then spoke for the first time. "Put his hand on the edge of that," he said, indicating a stone font that we had stored down there. "I'll make him open it." Cranthorpe forced my hand onto the edge of the font. "Here's how this is going to work," said Davis. "With every minute that passes, I'm going to cut off one of your fingers until you tell us how to open the exit." He pressed the end of the machete onto my little finger. I could hear a distinct shake in Davis's voice, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. I wondered what terrible experiences, perhaps in early childhood, had led him down this path of iniquity. "It does not open from the inside," I repeated. "I'm no keener on remaining down here all night than you are, believe me." "Here goes number one then," said Davis, and he began to position himself so as to be able to exert maximum force on the machete, but Cranthorpe intervened. "I reckon he's telling the truth, mate," he said. "This is pointless. We'll have to find another way out of here." "What other way?" said Davis. "That is the way out." He nodded at the slab. "The tunnels," said Cranthorpe. "What tunnels?" said Davis. "There has been a persistent rumour that there are hidden tunnels under the church. There are indeed certain tunnels under St. Anthony's, but they lead only to burial vaults. However, there had long been a rumour of a tunnel that led from the church all the way to the nearby Snake Inn, which claims to be one of the oldest public houses in England. Since the public house vastly predates the church, I had always considered these rumours absurd. But it is true that St. Anthony's was built on the site of an old monastery, so it was always possible that earlier tunnels had been preserved. It was this rumour that Cranthorpe proceeded to relate. "Do you know about this?" said Davis to me after Cranthorpe had finished. "No," I said, "I don't believe the rumours." "He's just the junior guy here," said Cranthorpe. "What would he know anyway? Let's have a look." We proceeded to explore all the side tunnels one after the other. In places there was very little light, and Cranthorpe found it necessary to investigate every inch of the walls and floor using his fingertips, but to no avail. Eventually even he had to admit defeat. "If there was an entrance to a tunnel down here, I think I would know about it," I said, fervently hoping my words would not provoke the men. In the event, Davis banged my head with the side of the machete, drawing a small amount of blood. "It's back to plan A then," he said. "Let me think for a minute," said Cranthorpe, raising a calming hand towards him in the gloom. Cranthorpe gazed silently around the dark corners of the crypt, and I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. Suddenly he announced, "I've got it, this way," and he led us confidently off into what we customarily referred to as the Chamber of Souls, for reasons that are lost to history. "We've already been down here," Davis complained. Cranthorpe ignored him, half feeling his way into the semi-darkness. We eventually arrived at the end, where a dim, naked electric bulb illuminated the remains of Sir George Whittle, a scientist and great patron of the church, who had personally spent many years restoring and enlarging the old crypts in the 1930s. "There's nothing here," said Davis. "We've already checked it." "I'm afraid I must concur," I said, risking another blow. "The drain," said Cranthorpe, pointing to a metal grate in the floor. "Where does it go?" "As far as I know, it emerges further down the hill somewhere near the river," I replied. "The crypt is prone to flooding in the rain, so it was felt necessary to install drainage. The pipes wouldn't be big enough for people to get through, though, I shouldn't imagine." "Pull the grate up," said Cranthorpe. I knelt wearily on the floor, which was already distinctly wet due to the drizzle outside, and attempted to prise the grating up. It was heavy and well rusted, and I couldn't move it. "Give him a hand," Cranthorpe said to Davis. "You do it," said Davis. "It's your idea." "I've got the gun," replied Cranthorpe. "You don't want him running off and locking us in, do you?" Davis reluctantly knelt on the opposite side of the grate and lent his considerable strength to the task. We discovered that by rocking the grate back and forth, it was possible to loosen it, and after perhaps 5 minutes of effort, we were able to lift it up. Underneath was a pit, perhaps 5 feet in depth, as I already knew, and one could of course deduce that pipes led out from the pit and emerged on the hillside. I believed in fact that I knew exactly where the pipes emerged, at a site several feet above the riverbank. Water could be observed to gush forth from there whenever the crypts began to flood. The 2 men and I peered into the dark chasm before us. "Get down there and take a look," said Cranthorpe to me. "It's just for drainage," I told him. "It could be dangerous." He smacked the side of my head viciously with the butt of his shotgun. Again I was brought almost to tears at the thought of what these poor boys must have been through to make them act like this. What terrible systemic inequalities must they have experienced. I blamed myself for not having sought them out and invited them personally to our Sunday services, which might perhaps have brought them some comfort and spiritual guidance. As soon as the stars twinkling rather beautifully around my field of vision subsided, I began to lower myself into the abyss with the assistance of Davis. At the bottom I found myself ankle deep in water, but I discovered that indeed a pipe of perhaps as much as 3 feet in diameter led off somewhere at a slight downward angle. "There is a tunnel here," I said, "but it's not very big and there's running water in the bottom of it." "That's our way out," said Cranthorpe. "We've no idea where it goes," said Davis. "You're off your head if you think I'm going down there. Better half an hour crawling through a filthy tunnel than 5 years in the slammer," said Cranthorpe. "You do as you please, but I'm going to take my chances." "I definitely wouldn't recommend this course of action," I said. "No one asked your opinion," said Davis tersely. Here he adjoined several insulting adjectives and a noun, which it is not necessary to reproduce in writing. "Get him back up here," said Cranthorpe, and Davis proceeded to haul me up out of the hole. "OK, how are we going to do this then?" said Davis when I was finally standing in the crypt with them again, covered in filth and grime. "I'll go first," said Cranthorpe. "The priest goes next, pushing the bag of bucks. You take up the rear." Davis appeared rather uncertain, not to say distinctly anxious, but after some moments of reflection he nodded reluctantly. "Let's get on with it," he said. Cranthorpe dropped agilely into the pit and began to crawl into the tunnel. I followed, and then Davis brought up the rear, lowering himself into the pit only with enormous difficulty and grunting as he dropped to his knees and began to make his way into the pipe behind me. To say the situation was claustrophobic would be quite an understatement. The tunnel was never more than 3 feet in diameter at its widest points, and was often narrower than that. My knees were immersed in water. Worst of all, there was no light at all, and we could see precisely nothing once we had progressed a few yards into the pipe. The slight but definite downhill gradient made things all the worse. I was only comforted by the thought that, should we eventually arrive at a dead end, or should the pipe become too small to crawl through, we would face relatively little difficulty in reversing our direction and returning to the crypt, crawling backwards. My own place in heaven is assured, but I greatly feared for the souls of these 2 misguided fellows in the event of us becoming stuck. I reassured myself with the thought that most likely we would eventually be forced to retrace our steps, so to speak, and perhaps one day I will be able to minister to these men in prison and set them on the path not merely to worldly freedom, but to the far more valuable goal of heavenly righteousness. Even so, I'll admit that the tightness of the space, the smell of decaying organic matter, the steady trickle of water running underneath my knees, and the complete darkness began to weigh on me somewhat for entirely personal reasons, particularly since the diameter of the pipe seemed to be decreasing at the same time that the downward gradient increased. "Maybe we should turn back," shouted Davis behind me. There was no reply from Cranthorpe. He continued to slither forward. I pushed the bag containing the Bibles, which was mercifully water resistant, another few feet forwards and slithered onward myself. "I say, maybe we should turn back," shouted Davis, a distinct tremor appearing in his voice. "I think I can hear something up ahead," shouted Cranthorpe. "What?" shouted Davis. "I can hear something moving about," shouted Cranthorpe. "What is it?" shouted Davis. The poor man sounded terrified. I wished I could offer him a cup of tea and a piece of cake, but that was quite out of the question under the circumstances. "Maybe people," shouted Cranthorpe. The pipe was becoming extremely narrow. I am somewhat wide in the shoulder, having been something of an aficionado of the sports of rugby and boxing in my youth, and I was having quite a job pushing myself onwards. The gradient helped, but the problem was that the pipe tended to constrict the movement of the arms. Davis, I had observed, was rather lacking in physical fitness, and I wondered whether he wasn't finding it increasingly difficult to move his considerable width through the pipe. The downward gradient did help, but it goes without saying that that was something of a Faustian pact or a double-edged sword, since it undoubtedly increased our chances of becoming a permanent fixture down there. Sure enough, after a few more yards, a cry emerged from Davis. "I think I'm stuck," he shouted, and his voice was filled with panic, verging on terror or hysteria. "There isn't any place to move my arms." "There's an opening up ahead," said Cranthorpe. "I can hear someone moving about. There's some sort of room or chamber." "Davis, grab onto my feet," I shouted. Davis moaned, but I felt him take hold of my ankles, and by exerting all my strength, I managed to help him move a bit further forwards. Provided Cranthorpe was correct about an opening being just ahead, it seemed to me that even Davis had a fair chance of making it out alive. I pushed the bag of Bibles on a bit. "Cranthorpe, how close is it?" I shouted. He didn't reply directly, but I heard him mutter something along the lines of, "What's that?" He sounded frightened. For the next few minutes, Cranthorpe seemed to be taking a rest. He didn't move, but I could hear him breathing heavily and muttering to himself. Periodically, Davis shouted, "What's going on?" in an absolute fever of terror. I tried to reassure him with remarks such as, "We're almost there," and "We'll be moving again in a moment." We had been in complete silence for about 30 seconds aside from Cranthorpe breathing heavily and Davis softly crying, when an ear-splitting roar emerged from the tunnel in front of me. It took me a few moments to realise that the roar was coming from Cranthorpe. He was screaming in agony. He began to shout, "Go back, go back," and to attempt to wriggle backwards. But I couldn't go back any further because of Davis, and Davis didn't seem able to move backwards at all. "Cranthorpe," I shouted, "what's happening?" There was only more screaming and then a sickening crunching sound, like bones being splintered. It then appeared, as best as I could make out given that the bag was in front of me and we were in total darkness, that Cranthorpe's entire body was dragged off at a tremendous speed, leaving Davis and I in silent darkness. I wondered, judging from the noise, if he had fallen into a particularly steep section of pipe and had shot off down it, but then an additional crunching sound reached my ears, very much like the sound of a large animal eating its prey. I could hear, or thought I could hear, bones being splintered and flesh being torn, as if by sharp teeth. "Cranthorpe," I shouted again, but there was no reply. Davis broke out into open sobbing. "Davis, we're going to have to go back," I said. In response, the sobbing only intensified. "We have to go back, man," I shouted. "Pull yourself together." "I can't," he moaned. "I can't move, I'm stuck." I closed my eyes and prayed silently. I felt at that moment as though God was instructing me quite clearly to continue forwards. That also seemed to be literally my only option in any case. I pushed on the bag of Bibles and wriggled forwards, but Davis's grip on my ankles intensified and I couldn't manage to pull him forwards at all. "Davis," I shouted, "you'll have to let go. I'll crawl out at the end of the tunnel and throw a rope back for you." There was a pause and then, "Where will you get a rope?" He sounded absolutely hysterical. "I'll knot some clothes together," I said, "then I can pull you out." "Don't leave me," he cried. "I won't leave you, Davis," I said. "Just let go of my ankles, otherwise we'll both be stuck here." Perhaps 20 whole seconds passed, but then he did let go of my ankles. I could sense his enormous reluctance from the sound of his laboured breathing. Once freed, I shuffled quickly forwards. To my enormous relief, the tunnel opened out and deposited me in a sort of room. I scrambled to my feet and began to feel my way around it. All the while I was wondering what had happened to Cranthorpe. Then the crunching sound resumed. It was only a short run of crunching, like the tentative chewing a dog might indulge in when its attention has been caught by something else while it's eating. Then came a low, hideous, unnatural growling. There was something in the room with me, something huge. I could smell its vile breath, which stank of rotting meat. In our tradition, we seldom make the sign of the cross, but I crossed myself now and began to quietly pray. I inched myself slowly along the wall behind me, my eyes straining to see the thing that sat opposite me, apparently chewing on Cranthorpe's corpse. Of course I could see nothing. There was not the slightest glimmer of light. Then, all at once, another sound arose, the sound of running water. Davis screamed, "It's flooding! Help me!" I started towards the location of the tunnel entrance, but a vast torrent of water hit me squarely in the stomach, knocking me over backwards. I could hear Davis gurgling and screaming, but I was quickly replaced with nothing but the thundering of a veritable cataract. The room was filling rapidly with water. I felt the bag, which I still held in my hand, being borne upwards by a tide that was already up to my waist. There was nothing whatsoever that I could do to help Davis. It was all I could do to avoid being drowned myself. As for the animal that had attacked Cranthorpe, I heard no further sign of it. It seemed to have made a swift exit, but how and where? For several minutes I counted my mortal body as lost. I fully expected to enter into heaven at any moment, but the Lord had further work for me to complete on the earthly plane. As I began to float towards the ceiling in the swirling maelstrom, my head banged against what I quickly realised to be the lower rung of a ladder. I allowed myself to be borne upwards until I could comfortably grasp the ladder with both hands, while fixing the sports bag onto my back. I can hardly hope to convey the enormous relief with which I ascended the ladder, while at the same time feeling enormous sadness over the loss of our dear friends Cranthorpe and Davis. I made a mental note to pray for their souls at the earliest possible opportunity. I was, as I later discovered, perhaps halfway to the top when I heard an ear-piercing scream from below. It was none other than Davis. I had been so discombobulated by the torrent of water that it hadn't even occurred to me that the water might have dislodged Davis like a cork from a champagne bottle. "It's got me," he was screaming. "It's got me." I immediately started back down the ladder to help the poor fellow, but I just as quickly stopped when I again heard the sound of bones being crunched and Davis fell silent. With a heavy heart I resumed my climb, confident that the Lord, having reaped the souls of his 2 errant children, would protect me. At the top I was able to push aside a stone slab to emerge in the basement of a certain inn. It was not the Snake Inn, in fact, but another, quite separate inn. I feel it is better if I do not here note which inn. I tramped up the cellar stairs in my filthy water-sodden robes, and the barmaid's jaw positively dropped open as I emerged behind the bar, still clutching the bag of Bibles. The entire room, filled as it was with perhaps 15 people, ceased its chatter and turned to gawp at this bizarre apparition suddenly in their midst. "Raining cats and dogs out there," I said. I'm not sure why I said that. I think perhaps I hoped they might assume I'd just come in via a back door. I left through the front door to find the rain had entirely ceased, although large puddles on the ground indicated a sudden recent downpour. I am pleased to say the Bibles were remarkably undamaged thanks to the sturdy waterproof bag that Cranthorpe and Davis had chosen for their activities. This ends the account of Reverend Asquith. Since his account became known, it has been confirmed that 2 men of the stated names did indeed go missing in 1962. No pit of the description given has been found in the church, although it has been noted that various works related to irrigation were carried out in the church cellars in the 1970s under the Reverend Asquith's instructions, and the pit may have been filled in. Thank you for listening. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. If you enjoyed this story, do consider giving it a like, and please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Thank you. Next week, assuming I can finish it in time, I've got a story for you inspired by the interesting experiments of a person by the name of Gordon Pask. Gordon Pask really existed and he claimed to have grown a metallic ear. This experiment of Pask's interests me considerably, so I've written a story around that, or at least I'm in the process of writing it now. Do join me next Monday for that, and until next time, sleep well.